It is now my honor to introduce Professor David Abulafia, Professor of Mediterranean History at the University of Cambridge and Gonville and Caius College. He has written widely on Mediterranean societies and civilizations in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and on the opening of the Atlantic and the encounters between Europeans and other peoples in the early modern period. He's written an enormous amount of books, so I'll just mention a few of them, like Frederick II, a medieval emperor, from 1988, Spain and 1492, Commerce and Conquest in the Mediterranean, 1993, a Mediterranean Emporium, 1994. This is terrifying. The Western Mediterranean Kingdoms, 1200 to 1500, the struggle for dominion, 1997. Mediterranean Encounters, economic, religious, and political, from 2000. And the absolutely wonderful, The Discovery of Mankind, Atlantic Encounters in the Age of Columbus, from 2008. And he has another book coming, The Great Sea, A Human History of the Mediterranean. It's an honor to have you here. Please, David Abulafia.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here to honor Natalie Zemon-Davis. And I'm going to talk actually about my latest book, which I've just finished, which is History of the Mediterranean. But what I want to make plain is the influence that I think we all feel from Natalie Davis's work. And I'm not just talking about her work, Trickster Travels, but also for instance, some work that she did on a Jewish businesswoman in early modern Germany, which certainly made me think a bit more about the role, I'll say a bit more about this later, of Jewish women in Mediterranean trade as well. Right, so today I want to address a fundamental problem in the writing of the history, not just of the Mediterranean, but of Mediterranean-like spaces, seas such as the Baltic, larger maritime spaces such as the Atlantic, dry open spaces such as the Sahara Desert. But I shall concentrate for lack of time on the Mediterranean we are familiar with, what I have once or twice called the classic Mediterranean. The history of that space has become something of an industry in the last few years, as seminars on the history of the Mediterranean have proliferated in universities and institutes, not just around the Mediterranean, but in the English-speaking world. I have found myself talking about the problems of writing Mediterranean history in Helsinki, and I sit as an absentee, totally ignorant of the language, on an editorial board in Japan, responsible for a journal of Mediterranean history. Yet, this is an ill-defined field of study, and I'm going to suggest that the concepts of decentered history, the global in the local, will help us give a sharper definition to the history of the Mediterranean and of other Mediterraneans. Well, I'm immodestly claiming the right to say something about this, having just completed this history of the Mediterranean for Penguin Books, entitled The Great Sea, A Human History of the Mediterranean, beginning with a Neanderthal woman who lived on Gibraltar about 24,000 years ago, and ending not with extinct humans, but with nearly extinct fish, the bluefin tuna that the Doha conference recently failed to save. I shall therefore be citing examples from Paleolithic times to the present day in the hope of showing that the Mediterranean was a space in which not just goods, but identities were traded, processed, and repackaged. I think there you can hear the influence of Natalie Davis's work already. My Mediterranean is resolutely the sea itself, its shores and its islands, particularly the port cities that provided the main departure and arrival points for those crossing its surface. This is a narrower definition than that of Brodel, which at times encompassed places beyond the Mediterranean, such as Madeira and Krakow, for cogent enough reasons. But the Mediterranean of Brodel and most of those who followed in his wake was a landmass stretching far beyond the shoreline, as well as a basin filled with water. And there's still a tendency to define the Mediterranean in relation to the cultivation of the olive or the river valleys that feed into it. This means one must examine the often sedentary traditional societies in those valleys that produce the foodstuffs and raw materials that were the staples of trans-Mediterranean commerce. And it also means taking on board true landlubbers who never went near the sea, perhaps never saw it once in their life. I want to concentrate on those who dipped their toes into it and best of all took journeys across it, participating directly in some cases in cross-cultural trade, in the movement of religious and other ideas, or no less significantly in naval conflicts for mastery over the sea routes, though that's an aspect I shall not be developing today. It's tempting to try to reduce the history of the Mediterranean to a few common features, to attempt to define a Mediterranean identity or a phenomenon of Mediterraneanism, and to insist that certain physical features of the region have moulded human experience there, as Brodel in particular emphasized. Yet this search for a fundamental unity starts from a misunderstanding of what the Mediterranean has meant for the peoples who have inhabited its shores and islands or have crossed its surface. Rather than searching for unity, we should note diversity at the human level. This ethnic, linguistic, religious, and political diversity was constantly subject to external influences from across the sea, and therefore in a constant state of flux, while movements from the interior towards the sea, barbarian invasions and the like, introduced the cultures, languages, and political traditions of areas close and remote in the hinterland of Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. From the first Paleolithic settlers in Sicily to the ribbon developments along the Spanish costas, the edges and islands of the Mediterranean Sea have provided meeting points for peoples of the most varied backgrounds who have exploited its resources and learned, in some cases, to make a living by transferring its products from better endowed to ill-endowed regions. These connectivities, as Peregrine Horden and Nicholas Purcell have turned such links in their book, The Corrupting Sea, have brought not just commodities, such as grain, oil, and wine, but individual migrants and merchants, missionaries and mercenaries, mystics and pilgrims, conquerors and slaves, from one shore to another, sometimes merging into an apparently dominant culture, but often transforming it by their presence, not to mention more transient modern visitors, such as tourists, who've also altered the Mediterranean by their demand for certain goods, facilities, and services. Those individuals who transformed this space were sometimes visionaries, such as Alexander the Great or St. Paul, to cite two very different cases. But I want to look at some overlapping groups, mostly very large ones, very large indeed. My first group is enormous, men. My second, for reasons I shall explain, seems much tinier and is women. So, how male is the Mediterranean I'm describing? Sedentary merchants might be women, as the evidence from the Cairo Geniza documents show for 11th century Egypt, or at least for the Jews of Egypt, and as the evidence from 12th and 13th century Genoa also indicates. In that era, at least, wives did not accompany their husbands on trading expeditions, let alone travel for trade in their own right, though attitudes to participation in business varied between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. A few European women could be found in the well-documented Genoese trading colony in late 13th century Tunis, but most of those we know about appear to have offered sexual services to the Christian trading community. Female participation in naval warfare is, as far as I'm aware, a 21st century phenomenon that has not been tested within the Mediterranean. But among migrants, whether the Alans and Vandals invading Africa at the time of St. Augustine, or the Sephardim expelled from Spain in 1492, there was often, though not invariably, a large female component. Even the armies of the early Crusades were accompanied by both noble women and bands of prostitutes. It is less clear whether the Bronze Age traders, known as the Sea Peoples, came accompanied to the lands in Syria, Palestine, and elsewhere that they settled. Indeed, a likely explanation for the rapid abandonment of their Aegean, Mycenaean culture by the early Philistines is that they intermarried with the Canaanites, adopted their gods, and learned their language. Yet one group of women has a particular importance for the history of the Mediterranean, female slaves, whose fortune varied enormously from the extraordinary power it might be possible to exercise within an Ottoman harem to the sad exploitation and debasement of those used for sexual purposes or assigned lowly work in the villas of prosperous Romans. During the Middle Ages, many of these slaves, both male and female, were brought out of the Black Sea, but those who inhabited the shores of the Mediterranean in the age of the Barbary corsairs and at many other periods also knew the horror of raiding parties that picked people off the shore, Christians off the coasts of Italy, France, and Spain, Muslims off the coasts of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. When King Francis I of France permitted the Turks to visit Marseille and occupy Toulon in 1543, they kidnapped the nuns of Antibes, among other victims. Still, the relative maleness of the traversed Mediterranean is something to ponder. The Italians seem to be right to say il mare, as opposed to the French la mer, or indeed the neuter Latin mare. My third group, mainly male as we've seen, is merchants. It hardly needs to be said that there's a massive literature on the transformative role of trade in all societies, even if it sometimes takes the form of a denial that long-distance trade in antiquity and the Middle Ages had a significant effect on economic development, as in the works of Moses Finley or Larry Epstein, both influenced by Marxist theory, and in the latter case by the debate about the transition from feudalism to capitalism. But I want to concentrate today on the people who traded, not the goods they carried. Among all those who traversed the Mediterranean, merchants offer the best starting point for several reasons. One rather positivistic one is that even before the Phoenician merchants spread the art of alphabetic writing across the Mediterranean, merchants have been anxious to record their transactions. We simply know a great deal about them, whether in Roman Puteoli, near Naples, in medieval Genoa and Venice, or modern Smyrna and Livorno. But, and here I think the issue of decentered history comes to the fore, the merchant pioneer is almost by definition an outsider, someone who crosses cultural and physical boundaries, encountering new gods, hearing different languages, and finding himself, much more rarely as we've seen herself, exposed to the sharp criticisms of the inhabitants of the places the merchant visits, in search of goods unavailable at home, or seeking to sell what his homeland and lands often far beyond have produced, such as spices. The ambiguous image of the merchant as a desirable outsider is there in our earliest sources. Homer was uneasy about merchants. On the one hand, Athena appeared at the start of the Odyssey before Odysseus' son Telemachus, posing as a princely trader. I call myself Mentes, son of the clever Anchialos, and I rule over the Taphians who are fond of rowing. And I have come here now with a ship and comrades, sailing over the sea that sparkles like wine, to foreign men, to Temese, to get bronze. I am bringing flashing iron. On the other hand, Homer showed contempt for mere traders of Phoenicia, suggesting that they were deceitful and unheroic, despite glorying paradoxically in the trickery of Odysseus, and the somewhat hypocritical sense that trade dirtied one's hands remained strong among patrician readers of Homer in ancient Rome. It was these Phoenicians, however, who ventured as far south as southern Spain, establishing colonies side by side with, but often apart from, the native populations of the Western Mediterranean, typically on offshore islands, easy to guard, for one never knew how long relations with neighboring peoples would remain warm. The Phoenicians provide me with a good example of what I'm trying to argue, so I'll stay with them for a moment. In the first phase, around the 9th to 7th centuries BC, there's a strong sense that these Levantine merchants are foreigners, outsiders, introducing peoples far from their own native land to exotic goods in return for local silver and copper. But over time, the goods they brought transformed native cultures, notably in Tuscany, where the Etruscans were hungry for Eastern artifacts, and in southern Spain, the home of the remarkable Iberian civilization. Then, as the Phoenician colony at Carthage became an economic and political power in its own right, relationships were transformed in a number of ways. Carthage itself became the hub of new networks of communication, a cosmopolitan meeting point between Levantine and North African cultures, a place where divergent cultures fused and a new identity may be said to have emerged, even if the city elite continued to describe themselves as people of Tyre in what's now Lebanon. Greek culture too gained a purchase in Carthage, whose citizens identified the Phoenician god Melkart with Heracles. Gods and goddesses, as well as merchants, crisscrossed the ancient Mediterranean. Additionally, the presence of Phoenicians and Greeks on the shores of Italy, individuals with a distinct cultural identity, acted as a yeast that transformed the villages of rural Etruria into cities whose richer inhabitants possessed an insatiable hunger for the foreign, for Greek vases, for Phoenician silver bowls, for Sardinian bronze figurines. Alongside merchants who came for the metals of Italy, we can soon detect artisans who travelled west to settle in the lands of the Barbaroi, knowing that their skills would probably earn them greater esteem than at home, where each was one of many. There are striking parallels in later centuries. Alien merchants are an obvious feature of the medieval Mediterranean, where we have the intriguing phenomenon of the ghettoized merchant visiting Islamic or Byzantine territory, enclosed in an inn or fonduk, as the term was, that also functioned as a warehouse, chapel, bakehouse, and bathhouse, with one for each major nation, Genoese, Venetian, Catalan, and so on. And here we're looking at the Mediterranean when Muslims, Greeks, and increasingly self-assured Italians were competing for control of the routes across the sea and the ports along its shores. The sense that the merchant might be a source of religious contamination and political subversion led the rulers of Egypt to lock the doors of these inns at night time, the keys being held by a Muslim on the outside. Of course, this only enhanced the solidarity and the sense of community that held these merchants together, while underlining the differences between the different groups of Italians and Catalans who coexisted in a rivalry Muslim emirs proved adept at exploiting. The Byzantines too set the Italian merchants apart in a walled compound during the 12th century, feeding xenophobia in the capital city with the ugly consequences of anti-Latin pogroms. This idea of enclosing distinct communities within walls was not then particularly novel when the King of Aragon first segregated the Majorcan Jews around 1300, which, as far as I can see, is the first Jewish ghetto in the Mediterranean. And I don't doubt that these merchant communities provided a useful model for the ghetto. These enclosed areas, whether of Jews or of European merchants, were places where a certain amount of privilege, self-government, freedom to practice one's religion, tax exemption, was counterbalanced by constraint, limitations on free movement, reliance on often capricious public authorities for protection, and so on. To speak of the Jews is to speak of merchants who had an unusual ability to cross the boundaries between cultures, whether in the early days of Islam, during the period of ascendancy of the Geniza Jews from Cairo, whom I mentioned earlier, with their trans and ultra-Mediterranean connections, or in the period of Catalan commercial expansion in the 13th and 14th centuries, when they could exploit their family and business ties to their co-religionists and penetrate deep into the Sahara in search of gold, ostrich feathers, and other African products that were beyond the reach of their Christian compatriots still stuck within their trading compounds. The prominence and mobility of a minority group is intriguing. Possibly we're just the victims of an imbalance in the surviving sources, which in the age of the Geniza, 11th century, are predominantly Jewish documents from Cairo. But they're good grounds for seeing Jewish merchants as pioneers at a time when the Islamic authorities strongly discouraged travel by Muslims into Christian lands. And before about 1050, Christian merchants lacked the capital and infrastructure, including merchant fleets, necessary to conduct intensive business in the Islamic Mediterranean. There are a few exceptions, Venice and Amalfi, but that's the basic picture. Now, at the same time, Jewish law encouraged maritime trade by placing much lighter restrictions on sea travel during the Sabbath day than applied for those traveling by land, since the wind and the ship did the work, not the traveler. And then these Jewish merchants were able to bring back information about the world beyond the Mediterranean ports that was recorded and disseminated across Mediterranean Europe and beyond in the remarkable Portoland charts and world maps produced in late medieval Majorca. As merchants moved around, so did information about the physical world. Often able to speak a number of languages and communicating by letter across great swathes of the Mediterranean and beyond, these Jewish merchants perhaps deserve the label cosmopolitan. But we also need to consider the port cities that, as it were, made a profession of cosmopolitanism. Port cities of very varied political loyalties, in which merchants and settlers from all over the sea and far beyond gathered and interacted. One port city that features again and again across the centuries is Alexandria, which from the very start possessed a mixed identity, combining Greeks, Jews, and Egyptians, and which only lost that identity in the second half of the 20th century as rising nationalism destroyed the cosmopolitan communities of the Mediterranean, not just there, but across the eastern Mediterranean. These port cities acted as vectors for the transmission of ideas, including religious ideas, bringing Greek gods and ideas about how to represent them physically to Etruscan harbours, or bringing the worship of Egyptian gods, such as Isis and Serapis, to Roman Ostia. And Serapis is himself an extraordinary state-initiated fusion of Osiris, Heracles, Hades, sundry other Egyptian and Greek and Levantine deities, a sort of Mediterranean deity, if you like. They became focal points for the spread of proselytizing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, each of which left an extraordinarily powerful imprint on the societies of the lands around the Mediterranean, including, again, Ostia, where the remains of an ancient synagogue that functioned for several hundred years have been excavated. The concept of the Mediterranean as a faithful sea, to cite the title of a recent collection of essays, needs to be taken into account its role as a surface across which not merely poor and anonymous pilgrims moved, but also charismatic missionaries, such as Ramon Lull, who died in 1316, after writing hundreds of books and pamphlets on how to convert Muslims, Jews, and Greeks to the true faith, without, it must be said, ever converting anyone. Yet Lull's career is a reminder that religious friction and confrontation is only part of the picture. He imitated Sufi verses and hobnobbed with Kabbalistic rabbis. He was at once a keen missionary and an exponent of old-fashioned Iberian convivencia, the living together of the three religions, recognizing the God of the three Abrahamic religions as the same single God. A different sort of convivencia existed in the minds of members of the religious communities that were expelled or forced to convert as Spain asserted its Catholic identity in 1492 and afterwards. The Marranos and Moriscos, Jews and Muslims who might or might not adhere to their ancestral religion in private while being expected to practice the Catholic faith in public. The ascendancy of the Sephardic merchants in the early modern Mediterranean is astonishing in any number of ways. Their ability to acquire and shed different identities, as Portuguese able to enter Iberia, and as Jews resident in Livorno or Ancona, an ability to cross cultural, religious, and political boundaries reminiscent of their forebears in the Carraginiza 6 centuries earlier. If I had time to look at other Mediterraneans, I would also want to mention the role of these Sephardim in the trade of the Atlantic world and of the Indian Ocean. These multiple identities, profitably studied in a recent book by Yirmiyahu Yovel, The Other Within, are an extreme case of a wider Mediterranean phenomenon. There were places where cultures met and mixed, but here were individuals with whom identities met and mixed, often uneasily. This was not a novelty. If we want to find earlier examples, we could point to the Jewish philosopher Maimonides, whether or not we believe that he was for a time a forced convert to Islam. For the imprint of Islamic philosophy on his thought was profound, whatever his personal history. Or there's the extraordinary Anselmo Turmeda, a missionary sent to North Africa to convert Muslims to Christianity, who himself became a noted early 15th century Muslim scholar after converting under the name of Abdallah at-Tarjuman, Abdallah the translator. One of the most interesting cases is that of Al-Hassan al-Wazan, Johanna al-Assad, Leo Africanus, so delightfully expounded by Natalie Simon-Davis in her book Trickster Travels. Here we have someone who could also convey to Western audiences the physical realities of the Islamic world way beyond the Mediterranean, and who switched back and forth from Islam to Christianity and back to Islam. The advantages of creating centres where merchants of all nations and beliefs were made welcome was not lost on early modern princes, whether in Western Europe or the Ottoman lands. Livorno, with its extraordinary privileges, positively encouraging settlement by Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and though less explicitly Dutch and English Protestants, provided a model for later port cities such as Trieste under Maria Theresa. Within the Ottoman world, Smyrna or Izmir enjoyed close ties to Livorno, and its rulers extended an equally generous welcome to all nations. A French visitor observed in 1700. The Turks are seldom seen in the Frank Street, which is the whole length of the city. When we are in this street, we seem to be in Christendom. They speak nothing but Italian, French, English, or Dutch there. Everybody takes off his hat when he pays respect to another. The Christians were free to operate their own churches and taverns, but they did so rather tactlessly, leaving the taverns open all day and all night and irritating the Turks by singing too boisterously in church. Toleration also produced tensions when communities exceeded the tacit limits of tolerance. There's an understandable tendency to romanticize these meeting places, and the darker reality of trans-Mediterranean contact in, say, the early modern period also needs to be borne in mind. The ascendancy between the 15th and the early 19th century of the Barbary corsairs and the close intersection between piracy and trade, reminding one of Marx's dismissive view that the early successes of the medieval Italian traders were really based on naked piracy, which actually may be fairly accurate. Before the final suppression of the Barbary corsairs, partly by the newly founded United States Navy, the Mediterranean had only ever really been free of a serious threat from piracy under Roman imperial rule, as a result of Rome's political control of more or less all its shores and islands. But piracy revealed some of the most extraordinary cases of mixed identity. Corsairs from as far away as Scotland and England, who outwardly at least accepted Islam and preyed on the shipping of the nation from which they came. This darker side of Mediterranean history also encompasses the history of those already mentioned, whom the pirates carried back and forth, male and female slaves and captives, though they too, like the historian Polybius or Leo Africanus, could play a notable role in cultural contact between the opposing shores of the Mediterranean. The unity of Mediterranean history thus lies paradoxically in its swirling changeability, in the diasporas of merchants and exiles, in the people hurrying to cross its surface as quickly as possible, not seeking to linger at sea, especially in winter when travel became dangerous. Its opposing shores are close enough to permit easy contact, but far enough apart to allow societies to develop distinctively under the influence of their hinterland as well as one another. Those who cross its surface are often hardly typical of the societies from which they come, if the word typical has any meaning anyway. If they're not outsiders, in some sense decentered when they set out, they're likely to become so when they enter different societies across the water, whether as traders, slaves, or pilgrims. But I've also tried to show that their presence can have a transforming effect on those different societies, introducing something of the culture of one continent into the outer edges, at least, of another. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Abulafia, for this lively introduction to the Mediterranean as not just a meeting place, but also a battleground of different ethnicities, and not least of the three Abrahamic religions. Wonderful. We look at the Mediterranean as something else than just a place to go for our holidays.